Welcome back. I am John P. Today we're going to be talking about watches as an asset class. Yes, is a watch an asset? And if so, should you invest in it? Now, this is a topic that I've touched on in the past, but I've had it phrased a little bit different. It's come from a different perspective. In the past, I've talked about whether or not you should invest in watches, and typically I have always recommended to buy the watches that you like because even myself, I wear the watches that I purchase for the most part. All of the watches in my collection, I manage to put on my wrist at some point in the day or the week or the month, and I really enjoy that. That's why I'm in watches, not only as a hobby, but also as a watch dealer through delraywatch.com. But today, I'm going to put a little bit of a different spin on it. This is going to be more focused through the lens of whether or not it's an asset, right? So there is some overlap when you make an investment in anything you expect to get a return, but sometimes assets can just protect you from things like inflation. And so when we're talking about watches as an asset, I think if we're going to be talking in the comments below, which I always welcome and also suggest that you chime in the comments below, I think it's a great idea for us to kind of define what I mean by asset here. And the way that I'm going to define an asset is this is going to be something that is used to produce positive economic value. This can be something such as a property, a land, an equity, or even crypto, right? This is going to be something that you want to realize some type of financial gain in the future. This is going to be something that is convertible to cash. I know in today's climate, not everyone believes in cash, but this is going to be something that should be convertible to cash. And this is going to be something that if it doesn't get you a realized gain monetarily, perhaps it brings in a stream of income, right? This is what I'm going to be considering as an asset, and most people would probably agree. And so after we've defined this, we really have to consider whether or not watches can be an asset. We see certain watches that are selling for more than double retail, right? Consider the Rolex Daytona ceramic bezel watch. These are selling for over double retail. And let's not even get into the FP Journes of the world or some watches like the Richard Milles that are selling for triple or quadruple retail price if you can even get them, right? So there are people that have realized gains or have speculated, purchased watches, made gains, or maybe they're holding on to it for the long term. And to them, this would be considered an investment. But we have to consider that this is a very new thing in watches. And so when we consider watches as alternative investments or alternative assets, or even assets for that matter, aside from the fact that it does have a value, right? You could look at it that way from the perspective of course it's an asset, it has value, but if we want to talk about it as being an asset that is going to realize you some gain in the future in some way, then we need to look at watches in three different types, categories, or tranches that, in my opinion, as a trader, a dealer, and also someone that does this every day, analyzes the industry, looks at auction prices, not only through your online platforms, but also places like Christie's, Sotheby's, all the other watch auction platforms. I've noticed some things, and there's three categories that the watches can be broken down to, and they all have a different level of risk or the risk profile associated with these categories. In my opinion, when you're looking at watches as an asset, it can be really easy to say, let me buy a Submariner because they're very hot and desirable. But we have to consider a few things when we're looking at these watches. So the first category is going to be the mass-produced watch. Now, it doesn't sound nice for someone that owns a Rolex to hear that a Rolex watch is mass-produced. I personally really enjoy Rolex, most of their models, including their sports models. I typically wear a Rolex watch every day, even though today I'm wearing a vintage watch, a vintage LaCultra Valjoux 72 on this kind of cool purple strap. I love this watch, by the way. Vintage, we'll talk about that in a second. But to get back into the topic here, when we look at these mass-produced watches, the reality is more are being produced every day, right? So the Rolex Daytona ceramic bezel, sure, the demand is very high, but we do have to consider that more are being produced every day. And while Rolex has made comments saying they can't keep up with the demand, very sorry, they still have the ability to, right? That's something we have to keep in mind, is that more of these watches are being produced every day. Now, I'm giving you kind of an extreme example, a watch that is likely to probably retain more value compared to others, right? Let's consider a Tudor Black Bay 58 for that matter. Recently at Delray Watch, we had someone trying to sell the Tudor Black Bay 58 in the silver, and they had purchased it, I believe, for some type of investment, and they saw the prices kind of pull back, and so now they're looking to sell this. Well, we do have to consider that these watches are being produced, and as soon as they just keep chugging these things out of the factory, people buy them, and that brings back the prices. So when we look at watches that are mass-produced, brands that are producing thousands and thousands, if not 1 million watches per year in the case of Rolex to be estimated, we do have to consider that this may be a decent place to park your money if you've put money in other places. By the way, I'm not giving financial advice, but compared to the next two categories, the mass-produced section might be a lot of fun. You might be able to get the watch that you like, that you love, that you want to wear every day. But in terms of speculation, with some rare exclusions to this rule, think Patek Philippe, this will fall in the next category. But if the watch is mass-produced, either the brand or the model or the type of watch, that is probably not a great asset that's going to give you a big return. And if it does, there was risk involved anyways, just because of the amount that are produced, and you're really speculating or making the gamble that they're not going to produce more. Now, they might not, but these next two categories are more sure to increase in value, namely because of limited supply. Now, this is going to be vintage. The next category is vintage watches. With vintage watches, they're just not making them anymore, right? This is a no-brainer. This is something that is not to be disputed. This is an irrefutable point that if you have a watch, a vintage Rolex, for example, Rolex is just not going to be able to produce more of these watches. This goes without saying. And so as there are more watch collectors, and as there are more people interested in watches and people willing to pay for these watches and are interested and become collectors and add more to their collection, and also as the world population grows, let's not forget about that. The world population is growing, which creates more watch collectors. There are just not more of these watches floating around. So if you want it, you have to pay the market price. So when it comes to vintage, they produced way fewer watches back then, decades ago, and there have been fewer to survive. And so once again, if people want it, they have to pay the market price, and there are people willing to pay the market price. You can see the hammer prices from these auctions, like the auction houses, Sotheby's, Christie's, so on and so forth. Watches that are vintage, that have not survived in mass quantities throughout the years, sell for record prices, and they keep climbing and climbing and climbing. And so when we see these news articles that talk about these record prices, this is what they're talking about. They're not talking about a modern day Rolex ceramic bezel Daytona selling for record prices necessarily. Now they are selling for record prices because we're in the midst of something where watch collecting is becoming a real popular hobby. But also, they're talking about these watches that are ultra desirable for a different reason, and it's the true scarcity and not just the demand. So, right, they have the different levers in the supply and demand. Well, there truly is no supply, and the supply is actually going down, whereas with the modern watches, the previous category, the supply is still going up. The demand may still far exceed the supply, perhaps, but it doesn't have to, whereas vintage, it kind of has to, unless all of a sudden someday everyone decides to not collect vintage watches, and I just don't see that. It doesn't make sense. The vintage world has become more of the art world, and art is very much the same type of scenario, and we've seen how that has played out over the last few decades. Now, lastly, this is going to include modern watches, but this is a special classification of modern watches, and special, I mean just a certain classification. This is going to be watches that are unique in some way, either a piece unique or very limited production. I mean limited in terms of maybe 20 pieces, 30 pieces, 40 pieces, not, a few thousand pieces, which is still limited, but in the grand scheme of things, how limited is a few thousand pieces? Special pieces or pieces unique or collaborative watches that are produced in small quantities are great or at least better than other modern watches in terms of them being an asset, because once again, this takes us back to the scarcity. The watches are unique. As time goes on, there are going to be fewer of these watches that circulate, very few examples that pop up for sale. And in watches, much like other kind of collectibles categories, when a collector wants something and they have the funding, and in watches, many people have the funding to purchase these things and, pay what the market demands for them. People will pay what the market demands. You see it once again in the auction houses, and people are not shy with their wallets when it comes to getting what they want when they can. And when we're talking about a few pieces or 40 pieces, and let's talk about high-end independent manufacturers, the Dufours of the world, or even, dare I say, FP Journe to an extent, because the demand has also increased in the supply. They produce about 1,000 watches per year. There is only upside potential as long as people are willing to collect watches. It is what it is. And so when we talk about watches as alternative assets or as an asset and trying to realize a gain in the future, the real key that I want to drive home here is the scarcity, right? Sure, it's still possible that they can make a ton, as just so long as a ton plus one want to buy the watch, it'll go up in price in the market. But if you want to increase the chances for yourself at the watch being considered an asset on the back end when you go to realize the gains later, please do yourself a favor and look for a unique watch, or a watch produced in lower quantities, or a watch that was produced decades ago that there's just not any more of them made. This is going to better ensure your chances at the watch realizing a gain in the future. Now, once again, I do want to wrap up this video with saying I enjoy watches to wear. You see all the cool things that I'm wearing on my wrist. You can see more on my Instagram, The Real John P. I have a lot of fun buying and selling watches. It's not only what I do, it's a passion and a hobby of mine as well. And I'm so fortunate and lucky to be able to do that. And so I always recommend, because I go by the same mentality. I'm not only adding watches to my collection that I think should be considered assets, or I think that there is a lot of upside potential. Now, a lot of what I do collect is vintage watches, so it could happen, but it's not always the case. It's not my primary concern. I know, not everyone wants to take a hit on the watches, but if you are the person that does want to see the watch collection you have go up in price as time goes on, please follow my suggestion and get things that are a little unique, a little special, or they're just not making any more of them. What do you guys think about watches as assets? Leave that in the comments below. I would love to see it and hear it. Please do not forget to check out delraywatch.com and my Instagram, The Real John P. Thanks, guys. You've been chatting with John P. Ciao.